We are in Antioch, California, northeast of San Francisco, a town of about 130,000 people.
Got all your stuff.
Kathleen Rognaby has been out all day with her two children.
You take that in the
They've been shopping. All of a sudden, she hears her daughter, Amia, screaming.
Mom, what is going on?
And her son looks at her with a strangled look on his face and says, Mom, there's blood everywhere.
You stay right there. Oh my God.
Kathleen runs out of the house and calls 911 hysterically.
What's the emergency? My cousin, he's laying on the floor in blood. Is he alive? I don't know. Okay, do you feel like you can go in there and help him? No, I don't want to go in there. I don't want to go in there. The officers are driving there as fast as they can, okay? I'm scared. What do I do?
Kathleen is too upset to realize what's happened to her husband, and when she finds out, she's going to be even more upset.
Came up over the air, and they were sending me to a medical call, and there wasn't a whole lot of details in there.
Ma'am, what's going on?
The family was outside. No one wanted any part with going into the house. Thinking to myself, like, what am I walking into? I walk in through the front door.
Mr. Eastman?
I go to turn into the kitchen, and I see the victim.
Jesus.
And there's this just huge pool of coagulated blood all around his head. And I can hear him breathe just slightly.
We got you. Hang in there, buddy.
The standard response from 911 when you report an accident and a bleeding victim, they send EMTs to the home, assuming it is an accidental fall.
He must have hit his head on the counter or something.
I'm kind of looking around, and I'm wondering, how did he get this? Did he have some type of medical emergency and he hit the tip of the counter? Trying to make sense of what's going on, and at some point, I remember medical personnel said, we're going to transport him. So I went to grab him by his feet, and as we picked him up on the inside part of his shirt, where his back was,
Hold up.
I saw something. And I'm like, there's no way. And I take a closer look at it, and I go, that's a bullet fragment.
Everyone stops. This is no accident.
And as he's being transported to the hospital, I got on the radio and asked for whoever else is available to come down here, because this is now an active crime scene.
Colley, take one. My name is Corporal James Colley. In 2016, I was working for the Antioch Police Department, assigned to the Investigations Bureau as a homicide detective. Being a detective, you're always on call. And anytime my phone went off in the middle of the night, I knew exactly what it was for. There's never confusion about what it means.
Gonzalez?
I partnered with Detective Gonzalez on this.
My name is Adrian Gonzalez. I'm a corporal with the Antioch Police Department, and this was the first time I would be on the lead team.
Adrian at the time was a newer detective working property crime. I saw some potential in some of the work that he'd been doing, and I wanted to start getting his feet wet in the violent crime homicide world.
Okay, everybody, listen up. Here's what we got.
We were told that the victim was a white male. His name was Rellis Eastman.
We found out Rellis had suffered a gunshot wound to the back of his head. He was alive, but historically speaking, if you're shot in the back of the head, it's probably going to turn into a homicide at some point.
Detective?
Officer Ramirez, what are we looking at?
We've got a Caucasian male found.
So Detective Colley arrives at this crime scene and meets Officer Ramirez of the Uniform Division, who is the person that called for their assistance.
I did the walkthrough with them, and it's not your cleanest house. There's just stuff everywhere, scattered throughout. So I just assumed this is how the family lived, and it was okay with them, these living conditions.
The house looked very normal from the outside, but when you walked inside, it was a pretty contrast to that. It was very unkept. The dishes weren't done, stale food. There was clothes everywhere. The home was in kind of in a state of disarray. Items that were just scattered about the house. It seemed very lived in.
We made our way back into the kitchen, and I explained to them exactly how the victim was when I got there.
The entire kitchen was covered in blood, to the extent of there was even some brain matter on the floor from where he'd been shot. Relis Eastman got shot right in the threshold of the door that leads from the garage into the kitchen.
Blood pattern suggests he was walking this way.
So Colley assumes that Relis Eastman was moving from the garage to the kitchen. He opens the door, he takes a gunshot wound to the head. It splatters some brain tissue and some blood on the door.
I was imagining where the shooter would have been standing. And that kind of gives you an indication of how a bullet was fired and where it was fired from.
If more than one shot was fired, it more than likely went towards the living room.
I remember Detective Colley kind of starts walking around, was kind of taking the scene, and there was a TV that was hanging on the wall, and the TV screen was cracked. And he goes,
"There's a bullet hole in this TV."
The bullet in the TV was interesting because you could tell it was a straight-on bullet hole. It didn't look like it had hit something and maybe skipped.
I remember saying, that looks like a .22, just because it's such a small bullet.
We honestly didn't know what to make of that. 22s are usually target practice guns. You can shoot small rodents with it, I guess, but to see that the murder happened with a .22, it was unique.
Channel 5 and 7 right.
So Colley begins, as all homicide investigations begin. He doesn't know what happened, but he's thinking what could have happened here.
We started throwing around some ideas that it may have been some type of home invasion or a botched burglary. Those are not uncommon in Antioch. Antioch, it's a nice bedroom community, but Antioch has a lot of crime out here. A few years ago, we were voted the third or fourth most dangerous city in California.
The street where Relis lived at, it's a pretty quiet neighborhood, but it's surrounded by some streets that are a little bit more notorious in the Bay Area for, drugs and shootings and homicides.
Let's look around a little more.
Could this be a home invasion that goes suddenly wrong when there is a homeowner present and shots are fired? Is that possible? Of course it is.
But there was nothing that stood out that would have been an easy guess for us.
The house doesn't indicate anybody rifling through things, turning over furniture, or emptying drawers.
None of the doors had been kicked in. None of the windows appeared tampered with. And so either this was somebody that Relis knew, maybe somebody that Relis trusted, somebody that was able to get close enough to him and shoot him execution style in the back of the head. We didn't know who to suspect, but we knew it was close enough to make it that personal. My partner and I really turned our attention to Relis himself and what Relis may have been up to or something that he was involved in, because obviously something had led back to his house where he had been murdered.
Who are you, Rellis Eastman? And why would somebody want to remove you from this earth? Detective Colley thinks the shooting of Rellis Eastman is personal, but nothing at the scene really points to any particular individual as being responsible. So they go back outside to see what else they can find that might be of some assistance.
And so they started walking the perimeter of the house.
Hey guys, come check this out.
They find a backpack. Well, what's that doing there?
Let's see what we got in here.
The backpack had some clothing items. There was a wallet, and inside that wallet was the driver's license of Rellis' oldest son, Scott Eastman.
We got more.
There was some marijuana and a pipe for it.
So now Colley's left with some thoughts. What if Scott's taste for narcotics has brought an element of danger to that family?
All right, put it all in there. Let's bag it up for evidence.
So Colley decides at the scene that he's learned what he can, which isn't much. He has a little bit. He needs a ton more.
If I have nowhere to go, I start looking into the victim themselves.
The people that have the best information about this victim are the family members. And of course, all these people are at the hospital at the bedside of the victim.
Rellis was in the intensive care unit. He was unresponsive. He was connected to monitors, and he had a breathing tube to assist to keep his lungs going.
I just sat there and I held my dad's hand for a few minutes and contemplated on if he was actually going to come home to us. Because every little girl wants her dad to come home.
Rellis grew up on a farm, in the farmland in the heart of Kansas. So he was a Kansas farm boy. And he had just joined the U.S. Army fresh out of high school. Later on, Rellis worked for a major telecommunications company.
My dad was a workaholic, supported my mom and 5 kids.
Rellis Eastman was trying really, really hard to scrape out an honest living and keep his kids on track in an area where you're pretty much surrounded by horrible influences growing up.
Majorly protective. My dad did not like any use of drugs. Marijuana was not something he was okay with having in the house or around us kids. Hang in there, Dad.
At this point, police were sort of standing by to treat this as a homicide investigation.
You want to ask his son about the drugs?
Yeah, I do. Start with the wife, though.
Interviewing his wife, that's the quickest way to learn something about your victim.
The wife is always the closest to the victim, emotionally and often physically. So he talks to Kathleen Rognaby.
Kathleen, what can you tell us about your husband? I mean, how's the family dynamic?
We've got 5 kids in total.
We learned that they had 3 girls in common. And then from a previous marriage, Scott is Rellis' son, Kathleen is his stepmom. And then there was a little boy, I believe he was 6 or 7 at the time.
How about your relationship with Rellis?
Honestly, it's not great.
Rellis and Kathleen were having marital problems. They were estranged, but they still lived together up until the time he was shot.
They sleep in separate rooms. They are going to organize themselves in a manner that they can then get a divorce.
I hate to say this, but he was just not a great husband.
Kathleen kind of wanted to paint Relis as kind of like a lech. Like he was always cheating, and he had all these women on the side.
That raises an eyebrow and is somewhat alarming to Kali.
We even threw around the idea that this could have been maybe a jealous husband or something that shot him.
So they finished with Kathleen Rogneby. They moved to Scott, the 21-year-old son of Relis Eastman.
Scott, we really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us.
Whatever you need.
Scott kind of came off very unassuming. He was a kind of short, very scrawny kid. He spoke in a really weird cadence. He didn't really make eye contact.
He gets the feeling and drift from the conversation that Scott is not the sharpest knife in the drawer.
Look, we found something outside the house we were hoping you could help us out with.
We challenged him about why your backpack was in the backyard.
Scott admits, I use marijuana. I leave it outside the house so I don't have a confrontation with my dad.
Scott said that he kind of had a strained relationship with his father. But he did say that he got along much better with his stepmom.
Scott, do you owe people money for drugs or anything like that?
No, I just smoke every now and then, that's all.
Talking to Scott, his low-level marijuana use, we didn't really see that as any type of link.
Samantha, can you tell us what you were up to this afternoon?
Well, I was down the street at a friend's.
And he described that he was with two of his buddies.
And they were playing video games, which is his routine. He often does this.
Scott said that he had been with these friends for the entire night, but he left for a short time. Relis would get upset when Scott drove at night, so Scott had to bring the car back.
Did you see your dad?
No,
Scott told us that he parked a block away and then walked back to his friend's house because he knew that if Dad saw him, that he would make him come into the house and he wouldn't be allowed to go play with his friends.
I get that, Scott. So my old man was strict too. Yeah, we'll let you go on and get out of here, okay? All right.
They failed to get anywhere with the family as to what might be involved here. They decide to go in a different direction. They do a neighborhood follow-up, knocking and talking with the neighbors.
We wanted to see who had residential cameras so we could maybe see who had been coming and going from the scene of the crime that night.
The world is under surveillance by the government or by your neighbor, but by someone.
Walking around that area, we found a couple of homes that looked like they had video cameras on them.
When he sees a camera, he stops and puts a business card on the door with a note that's saying, please call me, I'd like to see your footage regarding an incident. Smart.
Let's check this out. I just got something pretty interesting.
When Collier returns to his headquarters building, he is greeted by the ballistics report of the recovered slug. It is a .22 long rifle, and it's fired from a very unusual gun.
We got really lucky because our expert was able to link it up to an H&R 999 revolver.
An H&R Model 999 is a very antiquated revolver. The revolver breaks in half to get the spent casings out.
It is clear it came from a Harrington and Richardson revolver and from no other. So that's interesting.
This is Detective Colley.
Another big break that we had in this case is when I got a call from a social worker at the hospital where Relis was. The social worker had some concerns regarding the Eastman family, saying that they wanted Relis officially dead for a potential insurance payout.
So it turns out that the policy had a value of $1 million. So that gives someone 1 million reasons to remove Mr. Eastman from the planet.
You know, earlier today I got a call from one of Relis's coworkers.
This coworker told us stories about Relis and Kathleen and the dynamic of their relationship, about how conniving Kathleen was and how she kind of manipulated all the situations in her and Relis's life.
Colley begins to learn that Kathleen Rognaby has been bleeding Relis dry for 10 years, has had numerous affairs with other men, even produced a child with another man, still lives under his roof, still has him pay all of her bills.
It really painted Kathleen in a different light, because since the beginning, Kathleen put herself forward as the victim, as Relis is the one that had all the girlfriends. But in reality, it was actually flipped, that Relis was just a really good-hearted man that was walked over constantly by Kathleen.
Yeah, I think we need to talk to Kathleen again.
He realizes it's time to rethink Kathleen. So on the 30th of June, the medical staff in the ICU ward at the hospital informs the family that Relis Eastman is effectively brain dead.
I am racking my brain on what to do.
Sweetie, it's time.
And so my mom signed the papers to pull the plug.
Kathleen Rognaby makes the decision to end Relis Eastman's life. Now, is she within her rights to do that? Of course. But does she see $1 million in her future? And this is her motivation? Or does she want to stop the prolonged suffering of Relis Eastman? Which is it? One or the other? So when Colley gets that call about Kathleen being overly interested in the $1 million insurance policy, he brings in Kathleen Rognaby for further conversations.
I was really, at that point, looking at Kathleen as one of the main suspects. A lot of it was us calling her onto the carpet about certain things.
Basically, Kathleen Rognaby doesn't really say anything. I'm not responsible for this. I'm not involved in this. I didn't do anything.
Would you mind if we took a look at your phone?
We were pretty just blunt about it. Like, hey, would you be willing to let us look through your phone to see if there's any evidence of this murder on it?
That's fine.
And you could tell she was a little hesitant at first, but she gave over the phone.
She still wanted to play that. I'm being cooperative. Don't look at me as a suspect.
Sit tight. We'll bring your phone back in a minute.
Colley and I started to go through things like her messages and her phone calls.
And instantly what he found was interesting to us.
We find out she's having an affair. There was a thread with a male that was pretty obvious that that was not just a platonic relationship.
She was taking risque photos and, sending them to other men.
That is truly interesting, but that's all it is.
I started to go through things like her searches. When it comes to your search history, it's gonna show what you want in life. It's gonna show your plans.
Okay, look.
We find out that she had been researching Relis's life insurance about 3 weeks before he got murdered.
She has a very strong interest in the money that's involved in his life insurance policy.
It starts to make it look like Kathleen could have motive to be a part of this murder.
Can you tell us what you were doing the day your husband got shot?
She was able to provide receipts, and she was with her children in other parts of the city when the shooting occurred.
I don't think you could ask for a better alibi. There's no way in any sense of the imagination that she could have possibly done this, unless she's got an identical twin running around somewhere.
Here's a thought. What if someone else was in on it?
Like the guy she was seeing on the side?
Maybe. But who would benefit most from an insurance payout? Your son?
I remember telling Detective Colley, I really don't see Scott as walking into a phone booth, saying Shazam and becoming this murderer. He didn't seem to have that in him. But Collie and I discussed that there could be a scenario in which Kathleen and Scott had worked together on this.
So what's going on here, Scott? We shall see.
Scott, we just want to go over what you were doing the night your father was murdered.
The problems that we started seeing with Scott during the second interview, he began adding stuff to his timeline and his whereabouts. He told me he had gone to a chain store to buy this huge box of condoms.
So you went for condoms with what money?
The wallet was in the backyard. So then the question is, well, how are you going to pay for these condoms if you don't have any money?
I had just gone to...
And that's really when he started kind of slipping. You could tell that he was making stuff up on the fly.
When you start making changes, my boy, you're digging yourself a grave.
It's absolutely attributed to Collie's interview tactics. He's someone that's going to ask you hard questions, and when he senses that you're lying, he's not going to leave that subject.
And out of nowhere, Scott tells us, oh, I exited out of the store that has the Echo ATM on that side. And I'll never forget, like, that really perked Detective Gonzalez's interest.
Working in property crimes, I knew what an Eco ATM was. It's an unmanned kiosk where you can sell your cell phone. And a lot of times when people have their phones stolen, it can end up in these kiosks.
Why would you randomly say that you exited out of the store on the side that has the Echo ATM at it?
Scott says he stopped and got a few things when he was out that evening. Did you get some cash too, Scott, out of a cell phone machine?
The look on his face was like a cornered cat that just got caught.
I don't even have a cell phone.
He said he doesn't have a cell phone because he lost it. What if he needs to lose that phone because of what's in it? What better place to do it than there?
But no, if we find out you're lying to us, things are gonna get ugly. Officer, show him out.
So Collie is now faced with what? We have Mom, Kathleen Rocknaby, who has an ironclad alibi but a literal $1 million motive. Then we have Scott Eastman, who has a confused alibi and a somewhat altered one, but it's too early to say which of these could work. So we will continue to put one foot in front of the other.
My focus is on this, Eco ATM now. There's all these little hidden cameras all over the thing that take pictures of you and video of you throughout the entirety of your transaction.
Gonzalez calls the Eco ATM people, who are extremely cooperative, and provides Gonzalez with a video that may be of some use. They review that tape, and there is Scott Eastman.
It was approximately like maybe 5-6 hours before his father got murdered. He's at the kiosk selling this phone that he said doesn't exist, using an ID that he said he didn't have with him.
That was a big aha moment. Scott was going to these huge lengths to keep us from finding his cell phone, and we just found it.
So now we know Scott Eastman is a liar, and we can prove it. Why is he lying? That phone is probably going to tell us why he's lying.
We immediately went to the Echo ATM, got permission to get inside of it.
Wouldn't it be nice, as they say in the song, to find Scott's phone in that machine?
Okay, we're here. How do we get into this thing?
The person at the other end from Eco ATM told me these buttons to press that were kind of hidden around it. The ATM pops open, and at the very bottom, there's just this bin. And there's all these phones at the bottom.
They have just like a mountain of cell phones. And basically, you go through every single phone, you figure out how many of them are this right make and model.
I was nervous because I didn't want us to take this drive out there and then it not be there.
Here we go.
That's it?
Mm-hmm.
Nice job.
Finally, I found the right one, and I couldn't wait to get it back to the PD to download it.
Gonzalez races back to the station, does his magic on his computer.
Detective Gonzalez is the cell phone guru.
So the forensic software that we have will bring back deleted content. And the keyword search goes across Google searches, it goes across your text messages, it's gonna search all those at the same time. The very first search I did was for the .22 long rifle bullet.
When Gonzalez reviews the search information, he sits back in his chair and says, well, my, Scotty, you naughty little boy. What have you been doing? Nothing good.
Check this out.
There was just hundreds of searches that just blew up on the screen.
Scott Eastman is searching for Harrington and Richardson .22 revolvers in gun auction sites.
It just wasn't that Scott was searching about guns or just searching about ammo. For weeks, Scott Eastman was searching the exact ammo and the exact gun that killed his father.
After I'd found those, I typed in MOM for mom, and the keyword search just blew up. And there was just hundreds and hundreds of searches about incestuous pornography, or specifically about having sex with your stepmother.
We believed, and we had evidence from his phone, that Scott was in love with his stepmom. He was very affectionate to her. He had some of those risque photos on his own phone.
Scott Eastman apparently has a sexual fantasy about his stepmother. That's very, very strange.
That was like one of those like true like jaw-dropping moments, because I believe that he got it in his head that if Dad was eliminated, that they would have had his life insurance payout, and that would have made him one step closer to fulfilling whatever twisted fantasy he had about his stepmother.
So now they focus on the timeline of Eastman when he said he left his friend's house to return the family car.
Originally, Scott said that he left his friend's house because it was getting dark, and he parked the car and then came immediately back. When we verified that story with the father of one of his two friends, the father told us that Scott did leave, but he was gone for like a 45-minute period.
45 minutes. Are you sure?
Almost positive.
When we compared that to what Scott had told us, Scott made it sound like, oh, it was this, 10-minute time period. Again, the friends lived close to where Scott was. It's in walking distance.
So what was Scott doing for most of those 45 minutes? Could it be that he was executing his own father? As Colley is considering all of this, he finally hears back from a neighbor that has a surveillance camera that covers the street in front of Eastman's home.
It took a while for us to get this video. It was on a street right off of Bigelow where this murder happened.
When you look at the video from that house, it shows that at 8:53, Scott parks. He exits the driver's seat, but he doesn't go west, which is where his friend's house was, which is where he said he had been. It's going back home to where his father was shot.
He specifically told us that I didn't want to be seen by my dad because he would have made me stay in for the night. And he's literally on surveillance doing the exact thing he said he didn't do.
When he returns in the frame, he's coming from the direction of his own home. He opens the trunk of that car and probably concealed the weapon in the trunk of his car.
And that was the moment when everything else just kind of fell off to the side, and we knew Scott was our shooter.
So Detective Colley calls in Scott Eastman for another interview. They would like to get a statement from him that he's responsible for this crime.
Scott knew nothing at this point that we had all these searches, and I started really showing him, like, you need to come clean.
I like you the best, and I know that you feel the best when you're being honest. It's not forced. You don't have to think about it.
And then I got very confrontational with him.
Tell me about those searches.
They show him a printout of his search history for 22 pistols, for ammunition, for what it'll do to a human body.
I remember he was looking down at the paper, and he got this really tiny, meek little voice. And he just said,
That came from my phone? Your phone, yes. No.
I said, you're like interviewing 101. Every time that you tell a lie, like your body language gets smaller and your voice gets weaker.
What about these? Is that what you're into? I don't care. Like, I have my own taste in porn too. That's me. Yeah, if that's the thing you're into, that's what you're into. Yes.
He had denied that the ammo searches and the gun searches were his originally, but he was pretty upfront that that's what he was into when it comes to the pornography.
These are very specific. This isn't that I downloaded the library computer. This is your computer from your phone. Listen to me for a second. There's been big moments thus far.
Yes.
Can we agree with that?
Yes.
This is the biggest moment right now.
Yes.
I don't want a roundabout answer. I want you to be honest about these searches. These magically didn't appear on your phone, Scott.
Colley did a great job of like just chipping away at that.
Now, this isn't like randomness. It's all from the same phone that I recovered from the kiosk that you dropped your phone off at. Tell me what that means. What the
I mean, who did?
Who did?
I don't know.
I think it really flustered him to attempt to make up these storylines on the spot.
So, I get when you might see something like this that you're like, God damn it. Like in your mind, and you're like, that's not me. But the simple fact is that it is you.
I said, I know that you murdered your father, and here's all the evidence to prove it.
There was a long pause, and Scott eventually just said, I need a lawyer.
Scott was told from the get, like, you're free to leave at any time.
Scott Eastman has walked out of this interview in the hope that everything is just going to disappear. The difference is, when everything is said and done, Scott Eastman is going to disappear into a prison. Colley and Gonzalez have the evidence required to pursue Eastman for the murder of his father. But they wanted to try for a statement, and it didn't happen. So now they will take the next logical step. They will apply for and receive a warrant for the arrest of Mr. Eastman for the murder of his father.
I assembled an arrest team to go arrest him at his house. We all went there in full gear. You start dealing with people inside of a house, and things can go bad really quick.
We're sitting in the living room, and all of a sudden, there is banging on the front door.
I'll get it.
My mom is next to me. I open the door an inch. And by the time I have it open an inch,
Back up, hands up. Hands. Let me see your hands.
We are pushed into the corner with policemen running into the house.
Hands up. Kathleen, where's Scott? Get up.
Your hands.
And he stands up calmly. He's like, I'm right here. And they read him his rights and they handcuff him. And I remember hearing them say,
Scott Eastman, you're under arrest for the murder of Relis Carl Eastman III.
I didn't know how to react. I'm thinking they gotta be wrong. It's not possible that Scott would do this to us. It's not possible for Scott to have shot our own dad.
When it comes to murder, nothing is impossible, my dear.
Scott, he goes willingly. There's no issue. And Kali is talking to Kathleen. And one thing I remember very vividly is Kali saying, you know he's in love with you.
And I told Kathleen he murdered his own father thinking that you two were going to run off into the sunset. And the look on her face was bizarre, almost like, wow, did he really say that about me?
And I just thought about how that was kind of like an odd reaction.
What I believe occurred on June 25th of 2016 is Scott did park his car on the next street over. Scott then casually walked to his house and was met or confronted by his dad in the garage.
Are you high again?
No.
Don't lie to me. If I catch you doing drugs, you are out of here. Do you understand me?
I think Relis turned and just walked back into his kitchen because he knew who the person was. And I don't think Relis saw that as a threat.
Scott waited for his opportunity, and when Relis walked toward the kitchen, Scott came up behind him with a .22 caliber revolver.
Scott fired that weapon, and one of the projectiles hit Relis in the back of the head. And then based on surveillance, Scott then ran out of the house, back the way he came. He stopped briefly at the car, and I believe that Scott broke open the top of that revolver. And if you break those open too fast, the casings will go everywhere, which one of them was later found in the spare tire area of that car.
Kali and Gonzalez believe this is how the incident transpired. And when they take Mr. Eastman to trial, the jury finds Scott Eastman guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of the murder of his father. As a result of that finding, a judge sentences Scott Eastman to 55 years to life in the California penal system for this homicide.
Kathleen was never arrested or charged with anything because there was no evidence that linked her to the murder.
As far as the insurance money was split equally between Eastman's children, aside from the murderous one, of course.
I could not conceive of that type of violence. For Scott to pull a trigger, killing his father, it was not something that was anywhere in my imagination.
For him to take our father away from us, it's a horrid thing.
August 20th, 1989. Beverly Hills settled into another warm California night, the kind that made wealth look effortless. Palm trees stood motionless against a sky washed in deep indigo. Luxury cars rested quietly behind polished gates. Sprinklers whispered across perfectly trimmed lawns, and the windows of sprawling mansions glowed with soft golden light, hiding lives that looked flawless from the outside. It was a neighborhood built on appearance. Success lived here. Power lived here. So did secrets. On Elm Drive, one particular house seemed no different from the rest. The Menendez residence stood behind its gates like a monument to achievement. Every stone, every manicured hedge, every expensive piece of architecture suggested that the family inside had already won the American dream. Jose Menendez had climbed from humble beginnings to become one of the most respected executives in the entertainment industry. His wife, Kitty, maintained the image of an elegant Beverly Hills mother. Their two sons, Lyle and Eric, had grown up surrounded by privilege that few people could ever imagine. If anyone had driven past the house that evening, they would have seen nothing unusual. No shattered windows. No screaming neighbors. No flashing police lights. Nothing that hinted history was only minutes away from changing forever. Inside the house, television light flickered across the walls of the family room. Shadows stretched and disappeared with every changing scene on the screen. The air conditioning hummed softly in the background. Somewhere beyond the walls, expensive artwork hung perfectly still. Family photographs captured frozen smiles from vacations, graduations, tennis tournaments, and holiday celebrations. They looked like proof of happiness. But photographs never reveal what happens after the camera is put away. They never capture silence heavy enough to make breathing feel loud. They never preserve the look someone gives another person when no one else is watching. They never explain why fear can exist inside a mansion worth millions of dollars. At approximately 10 p.m., that silence was broken. Not by an argument. Not by a slammed door. By the deafening blast of a shotgun. Then another. Then another. The explosions echoed through rooms built to impress guests, tearing apart furniture, glass, and human flesh with equal indifference. Walls that had witnessed years of carefully maintained appearances suddenly absorbed blood instead of conversation. The television continued playing, its cheerful voices colliding with sounds that no family should ever hear. Within moments, Jose Menendez lay mortally wounded. Kitty Menendez was desperately trying to survive. The attack did not stop. More shots followed. By the time the silence returned, 2 people were dead. Their sons were still alive. And one of America's most controversial murder cases had just begun. When emergency dispatchers received the 911 call, the voice on the other end sounded desperate. It cracked between sobs and panic. The caller pleaded for help, insisting someone had killed his parents. To the dispatcher, it sounded like the aftermath of an unimaginable tragedy. A son devastated by violence. A family destroyed in an instant. Police officers responding that night had little reason to doubt him. The scene waiting inside was horrifying enough to support almost any theory except the truth. The bodies had suffered catastrophic shotgun injuries. Blood-covered furniture, carpet, and walls. The level of violence suggested rage, revenge, or professional execution. Detectives immediately considered possibilities that seemed far more likely than children murdering their own parents. Jose Menendez was a powerful businessman. Power attracted enemies. Money attracted resentment. The entertainment industry was filled with high stakes, failed deals, bruised egos, and dangerous associations. Investigators wondered whether organized crime had become involved. Others considered whether an unhappy business partner had finally decided to settle an old score. The surviving sons appeared devastated. At least, that was the first impression. And first impressions have a remarkable way of misleading investigators. For decades, people have argued over what happened inside that house. Some believe 2 greedy young men executed their parents to inherit millions of dollars. Others believe 2 abused sons reached a breaking point after years of terror that few people could comprehend. Between those 2 narratives lies one of the most emotionally divisive criminal cases in American history. Because unlike many murder cases, this one was never simply about who pulled the trigger. That question was answered relatively quickly. The real question became why. Why would 2 young men raised in extraordinary wealth destroy everything they stood to inherit? Why would they remain at the scene? Why would they call the police themselves? Why would they eventually admit to the killings while insisting they were not cold-blooded murderers? And perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all. Can someone be both a victim and a killer at the same time? Those questions transformed the Menendez case from a straightforward homicide investigation into something far more disturbing. Every piece of evidence seemed to support 2 completely different stories. Every witness appeared to strengthen one side while weakening the other. Every emotional courtroom testimony was matched by evidence suggesting calculation. Every accusation of unimaginable abuse collided with arguments about unimaginable greed. The deeper investigators dug, the more impossible certainty became. Even today, decades after the gunfire stopped echoing through that Beverly Hills mansion, people continue to disagree not merely about justice, but about reality itself. Because reality has always depended on which version of the family someone believed. To strangers, they were successful. To friends, they appeared ambitious. To business associates, Jose Menendez projected discipline, intelligence, and relentless determination. To the public, they represented privilege. But behind closed doors, according to later testimony, another family existed entirely. One built not on admiration but on fear. One held together not by love but by control. Whether every allegation was true, partially true, or impossible to prove has remained the center of endless debate. Courtrooms examined it. Journalists investigated it. Psychologists analyzed it. Filmmakers recreated it. Millions of viewers formed opinions after hearing the same evidence interpreted in completely opposite ways. Rarely has a criminal case forced people to confront such uncomfortable contradictions. A loving father or a relentless abuser. A devoted mother or a silent enabler. Spoiled heirs or traumatized survivors. Premeditated murder or desperate self-preservation. The answer depends almost entirely on where someone chooses to begin the story. Most people begin with the shotgun blasts. But perhaps that is already too late. Because murders are rarely born in a single night. They are often the final chapter of stories that started years earlier, hidden beneath ordinary conversations, family dinners, birthday parties, school photographs, and smiles convincing enough to fool almost everyone. Long before detectives photographed bloodstains on expensive carpets. Long before prosecutors assembled murder charges. Long before television cameras transformed a courtroom into national entertainment. There was simply a family. A father obsessed with achievement. A mother struggling beneath appearances. Two boys growing up inside a house that seemed to promise everything. From the outside, their lives looked almost perfect. From the inside, according to what would later emerge, perfection may have been the most dangerous illusion of all. That illusion would survive for years. Until one August night, when 12 shotgun blasts shattered not only a family, but also the carefully constructed image they had spent a lifetime protecting. And once those walls came down, America would discover that some of the darkest crimes are not hidden in abandoned alleyways or isolated forests. Sometimes they wait behind the front doors of the most beautiful homes in the richest neighborhoods, where success is measured in millions, silence is mistaken for peace, and the people smiling in framed family portraits may already be living inside a tragedy no outsider can see. The first patrol units arrived expecting chaos. Instead, they stepped into something even more unsettling. The house was quiet. Not peaceful. Not calm. Quiet in the unnatural way only violent death can make a place feel. The television was still glowing in the family room, throwing pale blue light across furniture that had been transformed into evidence. Expensive leather chairs were soaked dark. Broken glass sparkled across the floor like scattered ice. The sharp smell of burnt gunpowder lingered in the air, mixing with the metallic scent of blood until it became almost impossible to separate one from the other. Outside, Beverly Hills remained unchanged. A car rolled slowly down the street. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Sprinklers continued their nightly rhythm. The world beyond the gates had no idea that inside one of its grandest homes, 2 lives had ended with extraordinary violence. Officers moved carefully through the residence, calling out as they cleared room after room. Every instinct told them to search for an armed intruder. A killer willing to fire multiple shotgun blasts inside a home could still be hiding somewhere nearby. But every doorway was empty. Every bedroom was undisturbed. There were no broken locks. No shattered windows suggesting forced entry. No signs that anyone had searched for valuables. Jewelry remained where it belonged. Artwork still hung perfectly straight on the walls. Drawers had not been ripped open. The house looked less like the scene of a robbery and more like the ending of something deeply personal. Experienced detectives know that crime scenes begin telling stories long before witnesses do. This one whispered contradictions. The sheer brutality suggested overwhelming hatred. The victims had not simply been killed, they had been annihilated. Shotguns leave little room for hesitation. Every trigger pull demands intention. Every blast delivers catastrophic damage. The number of shots fired immediately raised difficult questions. Whoever had committed this crime had continued shooting well beyond what was necessary to guarantee death. That usually meant one of two things: professional certainty or intensely personal rage. At first glance, professional certainty seemed more plausible. Jose Menendez was not an ordinary victim. By 1989, he had built a reputation as a relentless executive who expected perfection from everyone around him. Success had followed him from company to company, eventually placing him among the most influential figures in the entertainment business. He negotiated multi-million-dollar deals. He managed powerful relationships. He worked in an industry where fortunes changed overnight and rivalries often became deeply personal. Investigators naturally looked toward his professional life. Could a failed business deal have escalated into murder? Had organized crime become involved somehow? Was someone attempting to send a message? The violence certainly looked theatrical enough to support those theories. Meanwhile, Lyle and Eric remained at the center of the growing storm. They were the surviving sons. The young men who had supposedly discovered the bodies. The grieving children who had watched their world collapse in a single evening. People who encountered them that night described visible shock, tears, confusion, disbelief. Nothing about their appearance immediately screamed guilt. Trauma affects everyone differently, and detectives understood that emotional reactions are unreliable measures of innocence. Some people collapse. Some become strangely calm. Some cannot stop talking. Others barely speak at all. There is no universal script for grief. That uncertainty worked in the brothers' favor during those first critical hours. Investigators treated them primarily as victims rather than suspects. Friends arrived. Relatives began making phone calls. The unimaginable task of notifying extended family unfolded behind closed doors. Word spread quickly through Beverly Hills. Jose and Kitty Menendez were dead. The news traveled with the strange speed reserved for shocking tragedies involving wealthy families. By sunrise, conversations had already begun in private clubs, executive offices, expensive restaurants, and gated communities across Los Angeles. Everyone asked the same question: who could have done something like this? The answers came easily. A business enemy. The mafia. A robbery gone wrong. Professional killers. Very few people looked toward the surviving sons. It felt almost unthinkable. Lyle was 21. Eric was 18. Young, athletic, educated, and raised with opportunities that most families could only dream about. They had attended prestigious schools. They played competitive tennis. They had traveled internationally. Their lives appeared to be moving toward futures shaped by privilege rather than desperation. From the outside, there seemed to be no reason. And murder without an obvious reason is surprisingly difficult for people to accept. Investigators spent the following days reconstructing the final hours of Jose and Kitty's lives. The couple had been home that evening. Nothing suggested they were expecting danger. No witness reported hearing a heated argument before the shooting. No evidence indicated a prolonged struggle throughout the house. Instead, everything pointed toward an attack that unfolded with terrifying speed. The victims had little chance to react. That detail quietly settled into investigators' minds. People attacked by strangers often display frantic attempts to escape. Furniture is overturned. Hallways become battlefields. Doors are left open as victims run for safety. Here, the violence remained largely concentrated. Fast. Explosive. Decisive. As forensic teams documented every inch of the residence, Photographers captured images that would later become infamous. Measurements were taken. Blood patterns were analyzed. Shotgun pellets were recovered wherever possible. Every fragment carried the possibility of answering questions that human memory never could. Outside the gates, television crews began arriving. Camera lenses pointed toward the mansion from across the street. Satellite trucks slowly lined nearby roads. The story had already become irresistible. A wealthy Beverly Hills family. A successful executive. A brutal double homicide. No arrests. No clear suspects. The ingredients were perfect for a media obsession. But while reporters searched for dramatic headlines, detectives remained focused on something far less glamorous. Patterns. Every homicide investigation depends on recognizing them. Who benefits? Who had access? Who had motive? Who had opportunity? Initially, those questions continued pointing outward. Toward business associates. Toward financial disputes. Toward enemies hidden somewhere beyond the family's social circle. Yet another pattern quietly emerged during interviews. Friends described Jose as brilliant. Demanding. Intimidating. A perfectionist. Few people seemed neutral when speaking about him. Some admired his discipline. Others respected him while admitting they feared disappointing him. Even positive descriptions carried an unmistakable edge, as though his expectations left little room for failure. Kitty inspired different reactions. People remembered warmth mixed with emotional struggles. Some noticed periods of sadness. Others recalled a woman who appeared increasingly withdrawn over the years. No single description seemed sufficient. Like many people living behind public success, she appeared different depending on who happened to be looking. The family portrait grew more complicated with every conversation. Still, complexity is not evidence. Investigators needed facts. And facts, at least initially, refused to cooperate. No eyewitness placed a stranger at the house. No murder weapon had been recovered. No confession existed. No obvious trail led directly toward any suspect. Cases built on circumstantial evidence require patience, and patience can become dangerous when public pressure grows. Every passing day without an arrest fueled speculation. Newspapers published theories. Television commentators invited former detectives to guess what might have happened. Anonymous sources claimed investigators were close to solving the crime. Others insisted the case had already gone cold. The truth was far less dramatic. Detectives simply did not know. What they did know was this. Someone had entered one of the safest neighborhoods in America, killed two prominent residents with extraordinary violence, and disappeared without leaving an answer that made immediate sense. Or perhaps, the answer had never disappeared at all. Perhaps it had remained inside the house from the very beginning, speaking to officers, comforting relatives, answering questions, and mourning alongside everyone else. The possibility was almost too uncomfortable to consider. Not yet. Not before the evidence forced investigators to look where they least expected. Because the most dangerous assumptions in any murder investigation are often the ones that feel emotionally impossible. And in the Menendez case, the emotionally impossible would soon become the central theory that changed everything. Days passed, but the silence surrounding the Menendez murders refused to fade. Instead, it grew louder. Every morning, newspapers carried another photograph of the elegant Beverly Hills mansion. Television anchors repeated the same grainy footage of police cars parked behind yellow tape. Reporters stood beneath cloudless California skies, speaking with certainty about a case that, in truth, was filled with uncertainty. Viewers across the country watched from their living rooms, trying to make sense of a crime that felt too brutal to belong in one of America's wealthiest neighborhoods. The questions multiplied faster than the answers. Who had wanted Jose Menendez dead badly enough to fire blast after blast at close range? Why had Kitty also been killed with such overwhelming violence? Had they been targeted because of business? Or because of something far more personal? Every theory seemed possible. None seemed complete. Inside the Menendez home, however, life had stopped. The family room no longer looked like the centerpiece of an extraordinary house. The television had gone dark. The furniture had been tagged, photographed, and removed. The carpet had been cut away in sections for forensic examination. Rooms that had once echoed with conversations now echoed only with the measured footsteps of investigators documenting every remaining detail. It is often said that crime scenes remember what people forget. Blood dries. Footprints fade. Gunpowder settles. But walls, floors, and shattered objects preserve moments with a brutal honesty that memory rarely can. Detectives returned again and again, hoping they had overlooked something, a fingerprint in an unexpected place, a forgotten receipt, a witness who suddenly remembered seeing an unfamiliar vehicle. Every investigation has a moment when it feels as though the truth is only one small discovery away. This was not one of those cases. The Menendez investigation seemed determined to resist simple explanations. Outside the crime scene, Lyle and Eric entered the strange, suspended world that follows sudden tragedy. Funeral arrangements had to be made. Family members arrived from different parts of the country. Condolences came from business executives, neighbors, friends, and acquaintances who had known Jose and Kitty through very different versions of their lives. People embraced the brothers. They told them how sorry they were. They spoke about unimaginable loss. No one could truly understand what it must feel like to lose both parents in a single night. At least, that was what most people believed. Grief has a way of making observers overlook details they might otherwise notice. A smile that appears too quickly. An emotion that arrives too late. A sentence that sounds rehearsed rather than remembered. Yet detectives knew better than to build a case around appearances. Human behavior after trauma is unpredictable. One person cannot stop crying. Another cannot cry at all. Some laugh nervously. Some become strangely energetic. There is no reliable formula for mourning. That principle prevented investigators from jumping to conclusions during those early weeks. But while detectives avoided assumptions, numbers remained stubbornly objective. Bank records. Credit card statements. Financial transactions. Unlike witnesses, money rarely lies. As investigators gradually reconstructed the family's finances, they began noticing something that did not immediately fit the image of two devastated sons struggling through the worst days of their lives. Large purchases. Expensive purchases. Unexpected purchases. Luxury watches. Designer clothing. Upscale restaurants. Sports cars. Business investments. The spending did not begin years later after healing had taken place. It began while the murders were still fresh enough that sympathy cards continued arriving at the house. Standing alone, none of those purchases proved anything. Young adults inheriting enormous wealth often spend recklessly. Sudden grief can also produce impulsive decisions. Psychologists have documented countless examples of bereaved individuals behaving in ways that seem irrational to outsiders. Trauma disrupts judgment. Shock alters priorities. Detectives understood that. Still, patterns matter. One unusual purchase may be meaningless. Several expensive purchases made in rapid succession deserve attention. The image investigators had formed during the first days after the murders began to shift almost imperceptibly. Not collapse. Just shift. The brothers were no longer viewed solely as surviving victims. They became something else. People whose actions required closer examination. That change happened quietly. No dramatic announcement. No television cameras capturing a breakthrough. Only experienced investigators slowly redirecting their attention toward the possibility they had initially considered almost impossible. The media, meanwhile, continued chasing larger narratives. Some newspapers emphasized Jose Menendez's business career, exploring whether ruthless corporate competition had produced dangerous enemies. Others speculated about organized crime despite the absence of convincing evidence. Rumors spread faster than facts, each one adding another layer of mystery to a case already drowning in speculation. For the public, the Menendez murders had become a puzzle. For detectives, They had become something more frustrating. A puzzle whose pieces seemed capable of forming two completely different pictures. One picture suggested calculated assassination. The other hinted at something hidden within the family itself. Neither picture was complete. Neither could yet explain everything. And then there was another uncomfortable reality. Families are often the last place outsiders expect to find the deepest secrets. Behind carefully maintained appearances, relationships can exist that even close friends never suspect. Control can hide beneath discipline. Fear can disguise itself as respect. Emotional wounds can remain invisible for decades, particularly inside homes where reputation matters more than honesty. Years later, when courtrooms filled with testimony about alleged abuse, manipulation, fear, and silence, millions of people would look back at these early days and wonder whether the truth had been present from the beginning. Concealed beneath assumptions that seemed perfectly reasonable at the time. But investigators in 1989 did not have the benefit of hindsight. They had only fragments. A brutal double homicide. 2 surviving sons. A fortune worth millions. And a growing list of questions that refused to disappear. As summer slowly gave way to autumn, the case entered one of the most dangerous stages any homicide investigation can face. Momentum began to fade. Public attention remained intense, but evidence was not arriving at the same pace. Detectives revisited witness interviews. They retraced timelines. They examined financial records from different angles. They searched for connections that might unite every contradictory detail into one coherent explanation. The answer remained just out of reach. Then, far from police headquarters. Far from television cameras. Far from the mansion on Elm Drive. A conversation took place in complete confidence. Not inside an interrogation room. Not under oath. Not with detectives listening from behind a mirror. It happened in a place where people speak because they believe their words will remain protected forever. One conversation. One confession. One decision that would eventually transform an unsolved double homicide into one of the most famous criminal prosecutions in modern American history. The investigation was about to leave behind the world of speculation and enter something far more complicated. Because from this point forward, the case would no longer revolve around a single question of who committed the killings. Instead, it would become a battle over why they happened. And that single word, why, would divide investigators, psychologists, attorneys, journalists, jurors, and the American public for decades to come. In the late 1980s, Beverly Hills was more than a city. It was an illusion that the world desperately wanted to believe. People drove through its palm-lined streets as if they were entering another version of reality, one where success could be measured by the size of a front gate and happiness seemed to grow naturally behind perfectly trimmed hedges. Luxury cars rolled silently past boutiques displaying watches worth more than most Americans earned in a year. Restaurants welcomed movie stars through private entrances. Expensive perfume drifted through hotel lobbies where producers, actors, musicians, and executives casually negotiated fortunes over lunch. To millions of people watching from televisions across America, Beverly Hills represented the destination at the end of every ambitious dream. If you lived there, you had made it. That was the promise. The Menendez family appeared to embody that promise perfectly. Their home stood on Elm Drive, surrounded by carefully maintained landscaping that reflected both wealth and discipline. Every inch of the property suggested order. The driveway remained immaculate. The lawns were trimmed with mathematical precision. Mature trees offered privacy from curious eyes, while high hedges quietly reminded strangers that not every success story welcomed visitors. It was the kind of house that made people slow their cars just long enough to imagine the lives unfolding behind its walls. Inside, polished marble floors reflected soft afternoon sunlight pouring through oversized windows. Expensive furniture had been chosen not only for comfort but for image. Family photographs rested on carefully arranged shelves. Tennis trophies occupied places where guests could easily notice them without anyone needing to mention achievement aloud. Every room seemed designed to communicate the same message. This family wins. Nothing looked accidental. Nothing appeared unfinished. Even silence inside the house carried a sense of expectation. To outsiders, the Menendez family represented everything that hard work was supposed to reward. Jose Menendez had built his reputation through relentless ambition. Born in Cuba, he had immigrated to the United States and pursued success with extraordinary determination. People who worked alongside him often described a man who refused to accept mediocrity. Long hours were normal. Impossible goals were expected. Failure was treated less as a disappointment than as a personal flaw demanding immediate correction. His career reflected that mindset. Step by step, company by company, Jose climbed through the fiercely competitive business world until he reached the highest levels of the entertainment industry. He became known as an executive capable of making difficult decisions without hesitation. Colleagues respected his intelligence. Many admired his discipline. Some feared him. In boardrooms, confidence became one of his greatest assets. He spoke with certainty. He expected immediate results. He believed excellence was not optional. For ambitious executives, those qualities often inspire admiration. Inside a family, they can create something very different. Kitty Menendez appeared, at first glance, to complete the picture of success. Elegant, stylish, poised. She attended charity events, social gatherings, and dinners where appearances mattered almost as much as conversation. Friends frequently remembered her as charming, capable of making guests feel welcome while maintaining the polished image expected in Beverly Hills society. Yet behind those carefully prepared appearances, people who knew her more closely sometimes noticed something harder to describe. There were moments when her smile arrived a fraction too late. Moments when laughter sounded practiced rather than spontaneous. Moments when exhaustion lingered around her eyes despite expensive makeup and carefully chosen clothing. No single observation meant very much. Everyone has difficult days. Everyone hides private struggles. But when dozens of memories are placed side by side years later, small details begin forming larger patterns. Some recalled Kitty seeming isolated despite living in one of the busiest social circles in Los Angeles. Others remembered emotional ups and downs that became increasingly noticeable as time passed. None of those memories explained what was happening inside the family. They simply suggested that the perfect image visible from the street may never have been entirely real. Then there were the boys. Lyle, the older brother, entered every room with visible confidence. Tall, articulate, and naturally charismatic, he often appeared comfortable speaking to adults. Friends described someone who enjoyed competition and disliked losing. He projected the same confidence that many people associated with his father, though sometimes it seemed less like genuine self-assurance and more like something carefully maintained. As if confidence had become another family expectation. Eric, younger by 3 years, presented a different impression. He was quieter, more reserved. His passion centered on tennis, where hours of practice filled much of his youth. Coaches recognized remarkable athletic ability. Family members invested enormous time and money supporting his development. Professional tennis represented more than a hobby, it became a dream carrying the weight of expectation. From the outside, the brothers looked fortunate beyond imagination. Prestigious schools. Luxury vacations. Private tennis lessons. Designer clothing. Expensive cars waiting somewhere in the future. The world saw privilege. The world rarely asks what privilege costs the people living inside it. Neighbors watched the family come and go without suspecting that anything extraordinary was unfolding behind closed doors. They saw a successful executive leaving early for work. A sophisticated mother managing social obligations. 2 young men preparing for adulthood. Ordinary routines continued day after day. Morning newspapers landed on the driveway. Gardeners maintained the landscaping. Housekeepers arrived and departed. Packages were delivered. The rhythm of suburban wealth repeated itself with remarkable consistency. Nothing visible suggested crisis. Nothing visible hinted at fear. That is one of the most unsettling realities about certain families. They become experts at performance. Not because they necessarily intend to deceive the world, but because maintaining appearances slowly becomes part of survival itself. Visitors see the dining room. They do not witness conversations after everyone leaves. Friends attend birthday parties. They never hear what happens once the candles are blown out. Teachers observe report cards. They cannot measure silence at the dinner table. Years later, during courtroom testimony, a completely different portrait of the Menendez household would emerge. The brothers described a home governed by control rather than affection. A place where achievement was demanded, weakness discouraged, and fear became woven into everyday life. According to their testimony, success was never enough. Winning simply delayed criticism until the next challenge arrived. Mistakes invited humiliation. Failure carried consequences that extended far beyond disappointment. Those allegations became some of the most fiercely disputed aspects of the entire case. Supporters believed they finally explained the unimaginable violence that occurred in August 1989. Critics argued they represented an elaborate attempt to justify calculated murder. Determining where truth ended and strategy began became nearly impossible. Yet regardless of which interpretation one accepts, there is little dispute about one reality. The Menendez family lived under extraordinary pressure. Jose expected excellence. He expected discipline. He expected absolute commitment. Friends and business associates often admired those qualities because they produced remarkable professional success. Inside a household, however, expectations can become something heavier than motivation. They can become fear of disappointing the one person whose approval seems impossible to earn. As Lyle and Eric grew older, the gap between the family's public image and its private reality, whatever that reality truly was, continued widening. Outside, the world saw a family standing at the peak of success. Inside, according to later testimony, emotional distance had already begun replacing warmth long before shotgun blasts shattered the illusion forever. From the sidewalk, the Menendez home still looked like a reward for a lifetime of hard work. No passerby could have guessed that beneath its expensive roof, invisible cracks were already spreading through the foundation of a family that the rest of America still believed was unbreakable. Success was the language spoken inside the Menendez household. Not the kind of success measured by personal happiness or quiet contentment, but the relentless pursuit of achievement that could be displayed, quantified, and admired. Report cards mattered. Athletic victories mattered. College admissions mattered. Appearances mattered. Everything seemed to exist within an invisible hierarchy where excellence was expected and anything less invited disappointment. For Jose Menendez, life had been built on overcoming impossible odds. He had arrived in the United States with ambition and little else. He believed discipline had transformed opportunity into success, and he expected his sons to adopt that same philosophy. To him, talent without relentless effort was wasteful. Excuses were signs of weakness. Emotions rarely carried the same value as results. People who worked with Jose often described him as brilliant, intensely focused, and capable of commanding a room without raising his voice. He possessed the kind of confidence that naturally drew attention. During meetings, others listened carefully because he spoke as though uncertainty simply did not exist. That confidence helped him build an extraordinary career. It also shaped the atmosphere at home. Lyle and Eric grew up understanding that their father noticed everything. How they spoke. How they dressed. How they carried themselves in public. Whether they appeared disciplined enough. Whether they worked hard enough. Whether they represented the Menendez name in a way he considered acceptable. Children raised under constant expectations often develop an unusual awareness of small details. A facial expression. A sigh. The slight change in someone's tone of voice. They learn to predict moods before words are spoken, adjusting their own behavior in hopes of avoiding criticism. Years later, psychologists would discuss exactly that dynamic while examining the Menendez family. Not as proof of guilt. Not as proof of innocence. But as part of understanding how families can function very differently behind closed doors than they appear to function in public. To neighbors, The Menendez brothers looked like young men who had every advantage. Lyle possessed natural confidence and social ease. Friends remembered someone who could command attention without trying very hard. He enjoyed expensive clothes, nice cars, and the lifestyle that came with growing up in Beverly Hills. Yet beneath that polished exterior, some people noticed flashes of insecurity that seemed oddly out of place. He wanted approval. Not just from friends. From his father. Approval that always appeared just beyond reach. Eric, by contrast, often seemed more comfortable on a tennis court than at a social gathering. Tennis became more than a sport. It became structure. Routine. An escape. Practice sessions stretched for hours beneath the California sun. Coaches pushed him physically, while expectations at home pushed him mentally. Every tournament carried meaning beyond trophies. Every match seemed connected to something larger than the scoreboard. Winning brought temporary relief. Losing felt heavier than defeat alone should have felt. According to later testimony, failure inside the Menendez household was rarely treated as a learning experience. It became evidence that someone had not worked hard enough. Whether that perception reflected reality or the brothers' later interpretation would become one of the central debates of the trials. What cannot be disputed is that both young men lived under extraordinary expectations. Even ordinary family moments appeared carefully managed. Dinner conversations often revolved around goals, plans, performance, the future. Jose reportedly envisioned remarkable careers for both sons. Mediocrity was never part of the conversation. The Menendez name, in his mind, represented achievement, and he intended for it to continue doing so through the next generation. To outsiders, that ambition looked admirable. Many parents encourage excellence. Many fathers expect discipline. The difference often lies in what happens when expectations are not met. Those moments remain hidden from almost everyone except the people living inside the house. Kitty occupied a more complicated position within the family. Friends described her as devoted to her children, but also increasingly fragile. Some recalled periods when she appeared withdrawn, struggling emotionally in ways that were difficult to explain. Others remembered warmth and affection, particularly during social occasions when guests filled the house. Like so much about the Menendez family, perceptions depended on perspective. No single version captured the whole picture. Over time, the brothers would claim that their mother knew far more about the family's private reality than she ever acknowledged publicly. They alleged she failed to protect them and, at times, contributed to an environment of fear herself. Those allegations would become some of the most emotionally charged testimony presented in court. The prosecution challenged them. The defense built much of its case around them. The public became deeply divided over whether they represented painful truth or calculated strategy. Long before those courtroom battles began, however, there existed only the family itself. For people sharing one home. For people carrying very different understandings of what that home meant. Visitors continued seeing elegance. Fresh flowers arranged carefully throughout the house. Artwork chosen to reflect sophisticated taste. Expensive furniture that suggested comfort without ever appearing casual. Everything inside the residence communicated success. Nothing communicated conflict. Appearances, however, are often the strongest walls a family can build. The stronger the image presented to the outside world, the more difficult it becomes for anyone to imagine something entirely different existing behind it. That contradiction sits at the heart of countless criminal cases. Communities frequently describe violent families using the same phrases. They seemed so normal. They looked happy. We never suspected anything. Not because neighbors are careless. Because private lives remain exactly that, private. By the late 1980s, the Menendez family had become deeply embedded in a culture where reputation carried enormous value. Business associates judged credibility. Social circles judged appearances. Success opened doors. Scandal closed them. Protecting the family image was not simply desirable. It was expected. And expectations, once deeply rooted, can shape behavior in ways outsiders rarely recognize. Whether that pressure created emotional wounds, as the brothers later claimed, or whether it merely reflected the demanding standards of an exceptionally ambitious father remains part of the enduring debate surrounding this case. What is certain is that beneath the polished image of wealth and accomplishment, tensions were quietly accumulating. Invisible tensions. The kind that leave no fingerprints. No bruises visible to neighbors. No headlines. Only subtle changes that become meaningful years later, when investigators and jurors begin reconstructing lives that no longer exist. The Menendez family continued moving through ordinary routines. Business meetings. Tennis practice. School. Dinner. Vacations. Photographs captured birthdays and holidays, preserving smiles that future generations would examine frame by frame, searching for signs that no camera could truly record. Was someone afraid? Was someone pretending? Could tragedy already be unfolding behind those expressions? Photographs never answer such questions. They simply preserve a single second while hiding everything that came before and everything that followed. By the summer of 1989, the Menendez family still looked, from every outward angle, like another remarkable Beverly Hills success story. Yet beneath that carefully polished surface, according to what would later emerge in court, years of resentment, fear, expectation, and silence had become intertwined so completely that separating one from another was no longer possible. No one outside the house could measure how close that family was to irreversible collapse. No one driving past the gates could have imagined that within weeks, the mansion would no longer symbolize wealth or achievement. It would become one of the most infamous crime scenes in American history, and every memory of the family that lived there would be re-examined through the shadow of a single, devastating night. Looking back now, it is tempting to search for warning signs. To imagine that somewhere in the years before August 1989 there must have been a moment when everything could have been understood. A conversation. A phone call. A confession. A visible crack in the carefully polished image the Menendez family presented to the world. But real life rarely offers such moments. Families do not collapse all at once. They bend slowly beneath pressures that outsiders cannot measure. Habits become traditions. Silence becomes routine. Fear, if it exists, learns to disguise itself as respect. Control can look like discipline. Obedience can be mistaken for love. By the time anyone outside the family begins asking questions, the answers are often buried beneath years of practiced normalcy. That was one of the reasons the Menendez case would eventually become so divisive. Not because people disagreed over the physical evidence. The evidence established one undeniable fact. Jose and Kitty Menendez had been killed by shotgun blasts inside their own home. The deeper conflict centered on everything that came before those shots were fired. Who had the Menendez family really been? The answer depended entirely on which voices people chose to believe. Former colleagues remembered Jose as one of the most driven executives they had ever met. He demanded excellence because he believed excellence was the price of success. In corporate America, those qualities often earned admiration rather than criticism. He was respected for his intelligence, his determination, and his willingness to make difficult decisions that others preferred to avoid. Friends who encountered the family socially often recalled elegant dinner parties, conversations about education and business, vacations, tennis tournaments, and ambitious plans for the future. Nothing about those gatherings suggested that the family was living on the edge of catastrophe. The Menendez home remained a place where appearances were carefully maintained. Guests were welcomed. Meals were served. Conversations flowed naturally. Laughter could be heard. No visitor walked away believing they had witnessed the slow unraveling of one of America's most infamous criminal cases. Yet later, during months of courtroom testimony, another picture emerged. Lyle and Eric described childhoods marked not by security, but by intimidation. They alleged that behind the expensive furniture and prestigious schools existed a world governed by fear, secrecy, and abuse. They claimed that the image presented to neighbors and business associates had concealed a private reality they believed no one would have accepted had it become public. Those allegations became the emotional center of the trials. Some witnesses offered testimony that defense attorneys argued supported the brothers' descriptions of the family dynamic. Others challenged those accounts or questioned their reliability. The prosecution maintained that whatever difficulties existed within the household did not justify what happened on the night of August 20, 1989. They argued the killings had been carefully planned, motivated by financial gain rather than immediate fear. The divide was profound. One side asked the jury to see two traumatized sons. The other asked the jury to see two calculating murderers. Neither narrative erased the other completely. Both forced uncomfortable questions that continue to divide legal experts, psychologists, journalists, and the public decades later. Because this case is not remembered simply for its violence. It is remembered because it challenged long-held assumptions about family, trauma, privilege, and justice. Could enormous wealth exist alongside profound suffering? Could years of alleged abuse remain hidden inside one of the most affluent neighborhoods in America? Could two people who committed an undeniably brutal crime also have believed they were acting out of terror? Or were those claims constructed only after the fact, designed to transform sympathy into legal strategy? There are no simple answers. Perhaps that is why the Menendez case has endured while countless other murder cases have slowly faded from public memory. It resists certainty. Every piece of evidence seems to invite another interpretation. Every conclusion leaves another question unanswered. As the summer of 1989 drew toward its end, however, none of those debates had yet begun. There were no television commentators arguing over childhood trauma. No documentaries. No podcasts. No courtroom sketches broadcast across the country. Only a family continuing its daily routines beneath the bright California sun. Jose remained deeply involved in his work, pursuing opportunities with the same relentless intensity that had defined his career. Kitty continued navigating the expectations of life in Beverly Hills, balancing family responsibilities with the social demands that accompanied their status. Lyle stood on the uncertain threshold between adolescence and adulthood, searching for direction while living beneath the enormous shadow of his father's expectations. Eric remained committed to tennis, spending long hours training, chasing a future that always seemed one tournament away. To an outsider, they looked like countless other affluent families striving toward success. They shared meals. They celebrated birthdays. They posed for photographs. They planned for the future. Nothing about those ordinary moments suggested that history was quietly moving toward them. And history often arrives that way. Without warning. Without dramatic music. Without anyone recognizing the ordinary evening that will later be remembered as the last normal day. In just a matter of weeks, the Menendez home would be surrounded by police tape. Detectives would move through rooms that had once hosted family dinners, documenting bloodstains instead of holiday decorations. Reporters would stand outside the gates describing unimaginable violence to a national audience. The names Jose, Kitty, Lyle, and Eric Menendez would become known far beyond Beverly Hills, spoken not in conversations about business success or athletic promise, but in discussions of murder, motive, and justice. Everything the family had spent years building, the reputation, the achievements, the carefully maintained image, would be eclipsed by a single night of irreversible violence. Yet before investigators examined shell casings, before attorneys presented opening statements, before juries struggled to reconcile conflicting versions of the truth, there was simply a family living behind closed doors. A family whose public identity appeared complete. A family whose private reality would soon become the subject of one of the most scrutinized criminal trials in modern American history. To understand what happened on the night of August 20, 1989, it is not enough to begin with the sound of shotgun blasts. It is necessary to understand the world in which those shots were fired. A world of extraordinary wealth, extraordinary ambition, extraordinary expectations, and, according to the competing narratives that would later emerge, either extraordinary deception or extraordinary suffering. The answers to those questions would not be found in the mansion itself. They would emerge slowly, piece by piece, through testimony, evidence, memories, and arguments that would span years. But on that warm California evening, before darkness settled over Elm Drive, none of those truths had yet been spoken aloud. The house still stood as a symbol of success. Its gates remained closed. Its lights glowed softly against the night. And inside, for members of the same family were unknowingly living the final hours before their lives, and the way America would remember them forever, were changed beyond repair. Every victim has two stories. The first is the story told after death. It is built from crime scene photographs, forensic reports, courtroom exhibits, and newspaper headlines. It is the version the world remembers because it arrives wrapped in shock, violence, and unanswered questions. The second story is quieter. It exists in ordinary mornings, family dinners, old photographs, forgotten birthday cards, and conversations that never make it into police files. It belongs to the years before tragedy transformed human beings into evidence. Jose and Kitty Menendez became famous because of the way they died. To understand this case, it is equally important to understand how they lived. Jose Menendez had spent much of his life believing that success was something earned, never given. He was born in Cuba during a period of political uncertainty, and like many immigrants who arrived in the United States searching for opportunity, he carried with him an ambition that rarely rested. Every promotion became proof that sacrifice had meaning. Every achievement justified another impossible goal. Every obstacle was something to defeat rather than endure. People who knew Jose professionally often described the same qualities using remarkably similar words. Driven. Demanding. Brilliant. Competitive. He possessed an unusual ability to recognize opportunity where others saw risk. Corporate executives admired his decisiveness. He understood negotiations, recognized talent, and expected people around him to perform at the highest possible level. That reputation carried him through an impressive career. By the late 1980s, Jose had become one of the entertainment industry's most respected executives, overseeing major business operations and working with influential figures whose names regularly appeared in newspapers and on television. To many colleagues, he represented the American dream fulfilled. An immigrant who had climbed to the highest levels of corporate success through discipline and relentless determination. Yet ambition has a curious way of shaping not only careers but also families. People who dedicate themselves completely to achievement often struggle to separate professional expectations from personal relationships. The qualities that create extraordinary executives do not always create peaceful homes. A boardroom rewards control. Children often respond to it differently. Friends occasionally caught glimpses of Jose outside the office. At dinner parties he could be charming, intelligent, and surprisingly engaging. He enjoyed discussing business, politics, and the future of the entertainment industry. He carried himself with quiet authority, speaking in a measured voice that rarely needed to become loud in order to command attention. When he entered a room, people noticed. Not because he demanded attention. Because confidence naturally attracted it. Those who admired him saw discipline. Those intimidated by him saw intensity. Both observations could be true at the same time. Kitty Menendez presented a very different personality. If Jose projected certainty, Kitty often projected warmth. She enjoyed creating beautiful spaces inside the family home. Fresh flowers frequently decorated the dining table. Holiday celebrations were carefully planned. Family gatherings reflected elegance without appearing overly formal. She understood the social expectations that accompanied life in Beverly Hills and generally fulfilled them with grace. Photographs from those years show a woman dressed with effortless sophistication. Smiling beside her husband. Standing proudly with her sons. Celebrating birthdays. Attending tennis tournaments. Vacationing beneath bright summer skies. Each image captured another ordinary family memory. None hinted at the controversy those photographs would eventually acquire. Years later, people would examine those same smiles searching for hidden meanings. Was anyone pretending? Did someone already feel trapped? Could suffering exist behind expressions that appeared so natural? Photographs refuse to answer such questions. They preserve appearance, never experience. Friends remembered Kitty in different ways. Some recalled a devoted mother deeply invested in her son's futures. Others described periods when she seemed emotionally exhausted, as though carrying burdens she rarely discussed openly. There were accounts of loneliness, moments of sadness, occasional withdrawal from social life. None of those memories, standing alone, suggested catastrophe. Many people experience depression. Many marriages become complicated over time. Life inside affluent neighborhoods is no more immune to emotional struggle than life anywhere else. Still, those recollections gained new significance after the murders. Every memory became evidence. Every conversation acquired new weight. People naturally searched the past hoping to find explanations hidden there all along. That search is understandable. It is also dangerous. Hindsight gives ordinary moments extraordinary importance. A quiet dinner becomes proof of marital conflict. An argument becomes evidence of deeper violence. Silence becomes mystery. Investigators must resist that temptation. Reality rarely organizes itself so neatly. The Menendez marriage appeared, from the outside, remarkably successful. Jose's career continued flourishing. The family enjoyed extraordinary financial security. Their home reflected prosperity. Their children attended excellent schools and pursued promising futures. To neighbors, they seemed fortunate. To business associates, enviable. To strangers, almost untouchable. That image became one of the central paradoxes surrounding the case. How could a family possessing so much become associated with such extraordinary violence? It is a question people continue asking decades later. Perhaps because wealth creates an illusion of protection. Money purchases privacy, security systems, prestigious addresses, expensive education. It cannot purchase emotional safety, nor can it guarantee trust between the people living beneath the same roof. According to testimony presented years later, the public image of the Menendez family concealed allegations of prolonged abuse and fear. The defense argued that beneath the polished exterior existed a profoundly dysfunctional household where control extended far beyond ordinary parental authority. The prosecution disputed key elements of those allegations and argued they did not justify the calculated murders that followed. The legal battle over those competing narratives would become one of the defining features of the trials. For now, however, it is enough to recognize that Jose and Kitty occupied two very different places within those stories. To some witnesses, Jose was a brilliant executive and demanding father. To others, he became the central figure in allegations of horrific abuse. Kitty was remembered by some as a caring mother struggling with emotional challenges. Others portrayed her as someone who failed to intervene when intervention was desperately needed. Those opposing portraits continue dividing public opinion to this day. What remains beyond dispute is that both Jose and Kitty were far more complicated than the labels attached to them after their deaths. They were not simply victims. Nor were they merely symbols within competing legal arguments. They were people. They had histories, dreams, flaws, ambitions, relationships that evolved over decades rather than days. The tragedy of this case lies partly in the fact that after August 20, 1989, those complex lives became increasingly reduced to courtroom testimony and forensic evidence. The man who spent decades building a career became known primarily for the allegations surrounding his final years. The woman who hosted family holidays became remembered through debates over what she knew, what she believed, and what she failed to do. Death has a way of rewriting biographies. Sometimes fairly. Sometimes not. And in few cases has that rewriting been more fiercely contested than in the story of Jose and Kitty Menendez. Before they became names spoken inside courtrooms. Before journalists dissected every aspect of their marriage. Before millions formed opinions based on documentaries, books, and televised trials. They were simply two people trying, in their own complicated ways, to build a family. Whether they succeeded, failed, or created something far darker would become the question upon which the entire case would eventually turn. The outside world, Jose and Kitty Menendez appeared to have built the kind of life that many people spend decades chasing. They had wealth. They had influence. They lived in one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in America. Their sons attended prestigious schools, competed in elite athletic circles, and grew up surrounded by opportunities that seemed limitless. Family photographs captured holidays in luxurious destinations, birthdays celebrated with elaborate dinners, and milestones marked by proud smiles. From a distance, theirs looked like a life untouched by ordinary hardship. But families are not defined by photographs. They are defined by the moments no camera ever sees. The conversations after guests have gone home. The silence that follows an argument. The expectations repeated so often that they become part of everyday life. Those moments rarely leave physical evidence. They survive only in memory. And memory, as every investigator and every courtroom eventually discovers, is one of the most complicated forms of evidence there is. As Lyle and Eric grew older, the family's public image continued to strengthen. Jose's professional reputation expanded alongside the entertainment industry itself. He was respected as a man who understood business better than most of his peers. He expected commitment from those who worked under him because he believed mediocrity had no place in a competitive world. His colleagues often viewed those qualities as admirable. Many successful executives shared similar traits. Long hours. High expectations. An unwillingness to tolerate excuses. Corporate environments frequently reward that kind of personality. Home life, however, follows different rules. A business negotiation ends when both sides leave the room. Family relationships do not. According to testimony presented years later, Jose's authority did not end when he returned home. The defense described a household where his influence reached nearly every aspect of daily life. Decisions were expected to be respected. Challenges to his authority, they argued, were not welcomed. The prosecution acknowledged that Jose could be demanding but argued that difficult parenting should not be confused with criminal behavior. Throughout the trials, attorneys on both sides fought intensely over where strict discipline ended and the allegations made by the brothers began. That distinction became one of the most fiercely contested issues in the courtroom. Kitty occupied a more ambiguous place within those competing narratives. Some family friends remembered her as affectionate and deeply invested in her sons' futures. She attended tennis tournaments, encouraged their education, and maintained the household despite increasing emotional struggles that some acquaintances believed had become more visible over time. Others recalled periods when she seemed isolated, as though she were physically present while emotionally somewhere else. Depression was mentioned by several people who knew her. So were moments of anxiety. Yet none of those observations offered a complete picture. Mental health rarely reveals itself in simple, predictable ways. Someone can laugh sincerely at lunch and cry alone before dinner. Someone can appear confident in public while privately feeling overwhelmed. Human beings are capable of carrying enormous emotional burdens without anyone around them fully recognizing the weight. That complexity followed Kitty into the courtroom long after her death. The brothers alleged that she knew about the abuse they described and failed to protect them. In some instances, they claimed she participated in an atmosphere of emotional intimidation herself. Those allegations became central to the defense's argument that the family dynamic had been profoundly dysfunctional for years before the killings. The prosecution challenged those claims vigorously. They argued that many of the allegations lacked independent corroboration and contended that the brothers had powerful reasons to reshape the narrative after admitting responsibility for the murders. As months of testimony unfolded, jurors were asked to evaluate not only physical evidence but also deeply personal memories reaching back into childhood. Few criminal cases demand that kind of emotional judgment. The result was a trial that became as much about the nature of family relationships as it was about homicide. Outside the courtroom, however, Jose and Kitty remained frozen in time. Newspaper readers saw only two smiling faces printed beside headlines announcing tragedy. Television broadcasts showed family photographs taken years before the murders. Vacation pictures. Holiday portraits. Formal studio images. The public searched those photographs for clues that did not exist. Could fear be seen in someone's posture? Could unhappiness be recognized in a smile? Could decades of hidden conflict somehow reveal themselves through a single captured moment? The answer was always the same. Photographs preserve appearance. They cannot preserve truth. Perhaps that is why the Menendez case has remained so emotionally divisive. There is no video recording of family life behind closed doors. No objective archive documenting every conversation, every argument, every ordinary evening that gradually shaped the relationships inside that house. Instead, history depends on memories. Memories influenced by grief, by trauma, by loyalty, by regret, by the passage of time itself. Some witnesses remembered Jose as inspirational. Others remembered intimidation. Some remembered Kitty as loving. Others remembered emotional distance. None of those recollections could fully erase the others. Human beings rarely fit neatly into categories of hero or villain. A person admired in one setting may be feared in another. Someone capable of kindness can also cause pain. Someone deeply flawed can still be deeply loved. That uncomfortable complexity often disappears once a criminal case captures public attention. People instinctively search for certainty. They want clearly defined victims, clearly defined offenders, simple motives, simple explanations. The Menendez case refused to provide any of them. Jose and Kitty were unquestionably victims of homicide. That fact has never been disputed. Everything beyond that point became the subject of one of the longest and most emotionally charged debates in modern American criminal history. As investigators would later discover, understanding who Jose and Kitty were required examining not only their public accomplishments but also the relationships that existed within the walls of their home. Those relationships, whether viewed through the prosecution's lens or the defense's, formed the emotional foundation of everything that happened on the night of August 20, 1989. Long before shotgun blasts echoed through the family room. Long before detectives placed evidence markers across blood-stained carpet. Jose and Kitty had spent years building lives that looked extraordinary from the outside. One had pursued excellence with relentless determination. The other had worked to preserve the appearance of stability even as friends noticed signs of private struggle. Together, they created a family whose image seemed almost impossible to reconcile with the violence that would later define it. That contradiction is what transformed this case from a tragic double homicide into a lasting national obsession. Because the more investigators learned about the Menendez family, the less certain anyone became about where the story of the victims truly ended. And where the story of the killers began 4 years before the night of the murders, the Menendez family lived in a world where appearance carried enormous importance. The right neighborhood. The right schools. The right friends. The right conversations. Everything seemed connected to maintaining a certain image. Beverly Hills was a place where people understood the value of reputation. Success was not only something you achieved, it was something you displayed. The homes, the cars, the social circles, and the professional accomplishments all formed a public identity that others could see. The Menendez family had mastered that language. Their home represented achievement. Jose represented ambition. Kitty represented elegance and social grace. Lyle and Eric represented the next generation of promise. But behind that carefully constructed image existed a family history that would later become one of the most disputed and examined stories in American criminal justice. To understand the tragedy that unfolded, investigators and attorneys eventually returned to the earliest years of the brothers' childhood. Before the money. Before the mansion. Before the courtroom. Before the questions of motive and punishment. There were 2 children trying to understand the world around them. According to Lyle and Eric's later testimony, their childhood was shaped by fear and confusion. They described a home where affection and anxiety existed side by side, where moments of pride could be followed by intense criticism, and where the expectations placed upon them felt impossible to escape. They claimed their father demanded perfection. Not improvement. Not effort. Perfection. A mistake was not simply a mistake. A failure was not simply a failure. According to their accounts, disappointment carried emotional consequences that remained with them long after the moment had passed. The prosecution offered a very different interpretation. They argued that the brothers grew up with privilege, opportunities, and advantages unavailable to most people. They pointed to their education, their lifestyle, and the financial support provided by their parents as evidence that they were not trapped children but young men who later made a calculated decision. The courtroom would eventually become the place where those two childhood narratives collided. But long before lawyers debated them, Lyle and Eric were simply sons living under the influence of their parents. Jose's personality shaped the entire household. His success became the standard against which everything else was measured. He had transformed himself from an immigrant with ambition into a powerful entertainment executive, and he believed discipline was the reason he had succeeded. That belief became central to the way he raised his children. From his perspective, preparing his sons for the future meant pushing them beyond comfort. The world was competitive. Weakness could be exploited. Failure could have consequences. A father trying to prepare children for hardship can sometimes create hardship of another kind. Where one person sees motivation, another may experience pressure. Where one person sees guidance, another may feel control. The difference often depends on the relationship between the people involved. And in the Menendez family, that relationship would later be examined under intense public scrutiny. Eric, the younger son, was often described as more sensitive and inwardly focused. Tennis became his escape and his identity. On the court, the rules were clear. The outcome was visible. A point was won or lost. A match was finished. There was no uncertainty about what was expected. For a young person living in a complicated emotional environment, that clarity can become powerful. The tennis court offered something the outside world could not always provide. A place where success and failure had boundaries. A place where effort could be measured. A place where the future seemed controllable. Lyle followed a different path. Older and more outgoing, he appeared more comfortable navigating social situations. He understood the importance of confidence and presentation. He carried himself in ways that reflected the world he grew up in, a world where appearance and achievement opened doors. Yet beneath that confidence, the defense later argued, existed a young man struggling with the same fears and pressures as his younger brother. The two brothers were different in personality. Different in how they responded. Different in how they expressed themselves. But they shared the same household. The same parents. The same environment. The same family history. That shared history became one of the most important elements of the case. Because after the murders, the question was never simply whether Jose and Kitty had been killed. The question was what kind of relationship had existed between them and their sons before that night. Had the brothers been entitled young men who destroyed their family for money? Or had they been psychologically damaged individuals who believed they were facing a threat they could not escape? The answer would depend heavily on how people interpreted the years that came before. The allegations made during the trials were disturbing and deeply personal. They involved claims of abuse that the brothers said began when they were children and continued over years. They described experiences that, if true, would have fundamentally changed the way people understood the family. But criminal trials require more than emotion. They require evidence, corroboration, credibility. The ability to separate what can be proven from what can only be claimed. That challenge made the Menendez case extraordinarily complicated. The victims were not strangers. The accused were not strangers. Everyone involved was connected by family. Every accusation carried emotional consequences beyond the courtroom. Every defense raised questions about responsibility. Every prosecution argument forced people to confront the brutal reality that even people who suffer can also commit terrible acts. That tension is why the case has continued to generate debate for decades. It forces society to consider uncomfortable possibilities that do not fit neatly together. A person can grow up wealthy and still experience pain. A parent can provide material comfort and still cause emotional harm. A victim can commit a crime. A crime can emerge from a complicated history without becoming justified. The human mind often searches for simple categories. Good people. Bad people. Heroes. Villains. But real lives rarely follow those patterns. Jose and Kitty were not only the couple found dead in a Beverly Hills mansion. They were parents. Spouses. Professionals. Friends. People with complicated personalities and complicated relationships. Lyle and Eric were not only the two young men convicted of killing them. They were also children who had spent years inside that family system before becoming defendants in one of America's most watched criminal trials. The tragedy of the Menendez case is that both realities exist simultaneously. Two people lost their lives violently. Two sons became responsible for that violence. And between those facts lies a history filled with questions that may never receive a universally accepted answer. As summer approached in 1989, the Menendez family continued living inside that unresolved world. The mansion remained a symbol of success. The neighbors continued seeing what they had always seen. A wealthy family. A beautiful home. A promising future. No one looking from the outside could see the invisible struggles that may have existed inside. No one knew that the final chapter of the Menendez family's story had already begun. Because tragedies rarely announce themselves. They do not arrive with warnings. They do not reveal the exact moment when an ordinary day becomes history. On the surface, everything still appeared normal. But beneath that surface, years of relationships, conflicts, expectations, and secrets were moving toward a night that would permanently change 4 lives. And once that night arrived, the world would never again look at the Menendez family the same way. The evening of August 20, 1989, began like countless other summer nights in Beverly Hills. The air was warm. The streets were quiet. The neighborhood moved at the slow, comfortable pace of a community accustomed to security. Behind tall gates and carefully maintained gardens, families settled into their nighttime routines. Dinner plates were cleared. Television screens flickered behind closed curtains. Expensive homes stood peacefully beneath the California sky, each one appearing untouched by the chaos that existed somewhere beyond its walls. The Menendez residence on Elm Drive looked no different. It was still a symbol of everything the family had built. A place where Jose Menendez had returned after years of professional success. A place where Kitty had created the environment she wanted her family to experience. A place where Lyle and Eric had grown up surrounded by privilege, expectation, and opportunity. That night, from the outside, it appeared to be just another quiet evening. But inside that house, something irreversible was approaching. The details of what happened in those final hours would later become the foundation of one of the most debated murder trials in American history. Prosecutors, defense attorneys, investigators, psychologists, and the public would spend years analyzing every decision, every movement, and every moment leading up to the violence. Because in a case like this, the timeline becomes everything. The difference between murder and self-defense. Between planning and panic. Between calculation and fear. Everything depends on what happened before the first shot was fired. According to the prosecution's version of events, the night represented the final stage of a plan that had been forming for some time. They argued that Lyle and Eric Menendez had made a conscious decision to kill their parents because they wanted control of the family fortune. The purchase of shotguns, the preparation, and the actions afterward were presented as evidence of planning rather than desperation. The defense told a completely different story. They argued that the brothers had lived under years of fear and believed their parents were about to expose or harm them. According to their account, the shooting was not driven by greed but by a desperate belief that they were facing an immediate threat. 2 interpretations. One night. One family. And one moment that would forever separate the past from the future. Earlier that evening, Jose and Kitty were inside the family room watching television. It was an ordinary activity. Perhaps that is what makes the memory of that night so disturbing. The victims were not walking into danger. They were not meeting an enemy. They were not expecting anything unusual. They were simply at home. The place where most people believe they are safest. The room itself represented comfort and routine. A television playing in the background. Furniture arranged for relaxation. A space designed for family life. It was not a battlefield. It was not a place where anyone expected violence. And then, sometime that night, the atmosphere changed forever. The sound of gunfire shattered the ordinary silence. The first blast would have been impossible to ignore. A shotgun fired inside a closed room creates a violent force unlike almost any other sound. It is not simply noise. It is impact. It is a physical event that fills the entire space. The calm of the home disappeared instantly. The family room became the scene of a devastating attack. Jose and Kitty were struck by multiple shotgun blasts. The violence was extreme. The number of shots fired became one of the most discussed aspects of the case because it suggested a level of intensity that investigators struggled to interpret. To prosecutors, it demonstrated rage and intent. To the defense, it reflected panic and terror. The same evidence would later be used to support two completely different stories. That contradiction would define the entire case. The attack ended. The house became silent again. But it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence left behind after something unimaginable had happened. The two young men who remained inside that home were now at the center of a mystery that would consume years of legal battles. Shortly afterward, Lyle contacted emergency services. His voice carried panic as he reported that his parents had been killed. The words would become one of the most remembered moments of the case. "Someone killed my parents." To the dispatcher receiving the call, the situation appeared straightforward. A son had discovered a horrific crime. A family had been destroyed. Help was needed immediately. Police officers arriving at the scene initially approached the case exactly as they would approach any other violent home invasion or targeted attack. They searched for an outside attacker. They looked for signs of forced entry. They examined possible escape routes. They considered the possibility that whoever committed the crime might still pose a danger. At that moment, suspicion did not immediately fall on the sons. The idea seemed almost impossible. Why would two young men with every reason to inherit their parents' love, support, and wealth become responsible for their deaths? It was a question that would later seem obvious. But at the beginning of an investigation, investigators are influenced by what they know at that moment, not by what they will discover years later. And what they knew that night was simple. Two respected members of the Beverly Hills community had been brutally murdered. Their killer was unknown. Their sons were grieving. The investigation had begun. But beneath the surface of that first impression were details that would eventually force detectives to reconsider everything. The violence had been personal. The family had secrets. The surviving sons had answers that were incomplete. And somewhere between the first emergency call and the eventual courtroom battles, the story of the Menendez family would transform from a shocking tragedy into a question that continues to divide people decades later. Was this the calculated destruction of two parents for money? Or was it the final explosion of years of fear hidden behind the walls of a beautiful Beverly Hills home? On the night of August 20th, 1989, no one had the answer. Not the police. Not the neighbors. Not the public. Not even the people who would eventually be forced to tell their version of what happened. All anyone knew was that inside a house built to represent success, two people were dead, two sons were left behind, and a mystery had begun. In the hours immediately following the shootings, the Menendez home became a place suspended between tragedy and uncertainty. Police officers moved through rooms that had been transformed from private spaces into an active crime scene. Every object that once belonged to a family now carried a different meaning. A chair was no longer just a chair. A photograph was no longer just a photograph. A doorway was no longer simply an entrance into another room. Everything had become part of a story that investigators were trying to reconstruct. The family room, once a place for ordinary evenings, became the center of a homicide investigation. The contrast was almost impossible to ignore. Outside, The neighborhood remained calm. Inside, detectives examined the aftermath of unimaginable violence. The Menendez home had always represented control. It was a place where every detail appeared carefully arranged. The landscaping was maintained. The rooms were decorated with expensive taste. The family projected an image of stability and achievement. Now, that image had been destroyed. The crime scene told investigators something important immediately. This was not a random act of violence. The person or people responsible had not simply entered the home, taken valuables, and escaped. The attack was focused. Personal. The victims had been attacked inside their own living space, in a place where they should have felt safest. That detail stayed with investigators. Criminals motivated by money often behave differently from criminals motivated by emotion. A robbery usually leaves behind a different kind of chaos. Drawers opened. Cabinets emptied. Valuables missing. Signs of searching. But inside the Menendez residence, investigators found something far more disturbing. The violence itself appeared to be the purpose. The question was why. At first, investigators looked outward. That was the natural direction. Jose Menendez was a successful entertainment executive with professional connections throughout Los Angeles. His career had placed him among powerful people in a competitive industry where relationships could shift quickly. Deals involving millions of dollars created opportunities, but they also created conflicts. Detectives considered whether someone connected to his business life had wanted revenge. Could an angry former associate have been responsible? Could a failed negotiation have created an enemy? Could someone from Jose's professional world have wanted him removed? Those possibilities were not unreasonable. In fact, they seemed more likely than the alternative. The alternative was that the answer might exist inside the family itself. And at that stage, few people were prepared to consider that. Lyle and Eric appeared to be grieving sons. They had lost both parents. They had experienced a scene most people could never imagine. To investigators and the public, their pain seemed understandable. But homicide investigations often reveal a difficult truth. People can appear exactly as expected and still hide unexpected realities. The days after the murders brought a strange mixture of public sympathy and private scrutiny for the brothers. Friends gathered around them. Family members offered support. The community reacted with shock. Beverly Hills was not accustomed to this kind of violence. The area was associated with wealth, safety, and celebrity, not a brutal double homicide inside a family mansion. The murders became a story larger than the people involved. News outlets wanted answers. The public wanted a villain. But real investigations rarely move as quickly as public curiosity demands. Detectives continued gathering information. They interviewed neighbors. They reviewed financial documents. They examined the family's relationships. They reconstructed the timeline of that night. Every conversation became important. Every detail was recorded. Every inconsistency became something to examine. And slowly, small questions began appearing. Not accusations. Not conclusions. Questions. Why had the brothers not immediately been considered suspects? Why had certain details of their behavior after the murders attracted attention? Why did some aspects of their lives after their parents' deaths appear unusual? Those questions became more significant as investigators learned more about what happened after the killings. A murder investigation does not end when the victims are discovered. Often, what happens afterward reveals as much as what happened before. The behavior of survivors. Their decisions. Their relationships. Their financial choices. Their conversations. All of these become part of the larger picture. In the Menendez case, the weeks following the murders would eventually become one of the prosecution's strongest arguments. The brothers had lost their parents. But they had also inherited enormous possibilities. And according to prosecutors, their actions suggested they understood that immediately. The defense later argued that those actions were more complicated. They suggested that young people dealing with trauma sometimes make irrational decisions. Spending money, changing lifestyles, and seeking distractions could reflect emotional instability rather than guilt. Again, the same behavior could be interpreted in two completely different ways. That became the pattern of the entire case. Almost every fact carried two possible meanings. The murders themselves, the family's history, the brothers' behavior, the alleged abuse, the financial motive, the confession. Everything existed inside a battle between competing explanations. But before those arguments reached a courtroom, detectives still had to solve the most basic question. Who killed Jose and Kitty Menendez? At that moment, they had a crime scene. They had two victims. They had two surviving sons. And they had a growing realization that the answer might not be as distant as they first believed. The investigation would eventually turn toward the people closest to the victims. Because in many homicide cases, the most important evidence is not found in a stranger's actions. It is found in relationships. Who knew the victims best? Who understood their routines? Who had access to the home? Who stood to gain from their deaths? Those questions slowly began changing the direction of the investigation. The beautiful Beverly Hills mansion that had once appeared untouchable was now revealing a different truth. Behind its gates, wealth had not prevented tragedy. Behind its walls, success had not eliminated conflict. And behind the image of a perfect family, investigators began searching for the hidden story that had led to the most violent night in Menendez history. The answer was still unclear. But the investigation was moving closer. Every homicide has a moment when suspicion begins shifting. When the impossible becomes possible. When investigators stop asking only, who would do this? And begin asking, who was already there? The night of August 20th, 1989, would eventually become one of those rare moments in criminal history where every second seemed to carry enormous significance. Years later, attorneys would replay the timeline in court. Investigators would examine it through evidence. Psychologists would analyze the behavior of everyone involved. The public would debate it endlessly. But on that night, there was no courtroom. No cameras. No experts explaining what each action might mean. There was only a family home, a violent crime, and the confusion that followed. After the shooting, Lyle and Eric remained connected to the only world they had ever known. The house where they had grown up. The rooms filled with childhood memories. The place where family celebrations had taken place. The same walls that had witnessed years of ordinary life now surrounded one of the most disturbing crimes in Beverly Hills history. For the brothers, the meaning of that house had changed forever. For investigators, it had become a puzzle. Every homicide scene contains a story. The challenge is determining which parts are facts and which parts are interpretation. The facts were undeniable. Jose and Kitty Menendez were dead. They had been killed inside their home. Shotguns had been used. The attack had been extremely violent. The victims had been found in their family room. Beyond those facts existed a vast area of uncertainty. What happened immediately before the shooting? What conversation took place? Who made the first decision? Was there an argument? Was there fear? Was there anger? Was there a plan? Those questions would not receive their answers quickly. And when answers finally came, they would come from people with a personal stake in the story. That is what made the case so difficult. There was no stranger at the center of the investigation. No anonymous criminal leaving behind an obvious trail. The people who knew the victims best were also the people whose actions would become the focus of suspicion. In the early days, however, sympathy remained strongly on the side of the brothers. Many people looking at the case saw two young men who had experienced an unimaginable loss. Their parents were gone. Their family had been destroyed. Their future had changed overnight. The natural human reaction was compassion. People wanted to protect them. They wanted to understand what had happened. They wanted the killer found. That emotional response was powerful. And it was not unreasonable. Most people are not prepared to imagine that a child could intentionally kill a parent. The bond between parent and child carries a deeply held cultural assumption that, despite conflict and imperfections, a child does not destroy the people who gave them life. When that assumption is challenged, people search for another explanation. A stranger. A criminal. An outside threat. Anything easier to accept. The Menendez case would eventually force people to confront one of the most uncomfortable possibilities in criminal investigation. Sometimes the person closest to the victim is also the person responsible. But that realization did not happen immediately. The first days after the murders were filled with uncertainty. The brothers attended memorial events. They spoke with relatives. They tried to continue living in a world that had changed completely. And then investigators began noticing another element of the case. The family fortune. Jose and Kitty had accumulated significant wealth. Their estate represented not only financial security but also a dramatic change in the lives of their sons. The brothers had lost their parents. But they had also become heirs. That fact alone did not prove anything. Inheritance after a parent's death is not suspicious by itself. Millions of people inherit property and money from loved ones every year. But in a murder investigation, financial benefit becomes one of the first things detectives examine. Motive. Opportunity. Access. Those three elements often determine the direction of a case. The Menendez brothers had all three. They had access because they lived in the home. They had opportunity because they were present. And they potentially had a financial motive because they stood to inherit. Still, investigators needed more. Suspicion is not evidence. A theory is not a conviction. The detectives needed to know whether the financial connection was simply a circumstance or whether it represented the reason behind the crime. As they continued examining the brothers' behavior after the murders, more questions emerged. The lifestyle changes were noticeable. Money began moving quickly. The brothers started purchasing expensive items and exploring new opportunities that seemed unusual considering how recently they had lost their parents. Luxury cars. Designer clothing. High-end purchases. Business ventures. To some observers, the spending appeared shocking. Two young men had just experienced the deaths of their parents, yet they seemed to be embracing a lifestyle made possible by that loss. To others, however, grief could explain unpredictable behavior. People respond to trauma in different ways. Some withdraw. Some seek distraction. Some attempt to recreate a sense of control by changing their environment. The meaning of their actions depended entirely on interpretation. And interpretation became the defining battle of the Menendez case. The prosecution would eventually argue. The brothers killed their parents because they wanted freedom and money. The defense would argue. The brothers acted because they believed their lives were in danger. Both arguments would rely on the same history. The same family. The same night. The same two young men. Only the explanation changed. But before the courtroom battles began, the investigation continued quietly. Detectives returned to the timeline. They examined phone records. They interviewed people connected to the family. They reviewed the brothers' statements. They looked for inconsistencies. Every case has a turning point. A moment when a vague suspicion becomes a clear direction. For the Menendez investigation, that moment would not come from forensic evidence alone. It would come from a conversation. A confession. A secret shared with someone who was never supposed to reveal it. But before that breakthrough arrived, investigators had to navigate months of uncertainty. Because the most challenging cases are not always the ones where evidence is missing. Sometimes the most challenging cases are the ones where every piece of evidence tells a different story. The Menendez home had given investigators the beginning of the story. The gunshots. The victims. The violence. But it had not yet revealed the reason. And without the reason, the crime remained incomplete. A house full of questions. A family full of contradictions. A mystery waiting for someone to finally speak. And eventually, Someone would. A murder investigation begins long before a suspect is identified. It begins in the quiet moments after the first officers arrive. It begins with photographs taken in rooms where people once lived ordinary lives. It begins with investigators standing inside a place that was once private and asking a question that feels almost impossible. What happened here? Inside the Menendez residence, every detail mattered. The house itself became a silent witness. The expensive furniture. The family photographs. The personal belongings left behind. The layout of the rooms. The objects that remained untouched. The objects that had been disturbed. All of them became pieces of a story that detectives needed to reconstruct. A crime scene does not explain itself. It only presents clues. And clues require interpretation. When investigators first entered the Menendez home, they were confronted with a scene of extreme violence. The family room was no longer a place associated with comfort or relaxation. It had become the location of a double homicide that shocked not only Beverly Hills but the entire country. The victims were found together. Jose and Kitty Menendez had been watching television when the attack occurred. That simple detail would become one of the most haunting elements of the case. They had been at home. They had been in a familiar room. They had been doing something completely ordinary. There was no indication that they expected danger. No warning. No chance to prepare. The attack had transformed an ordinary evening into a crime scene within seconds. For investigators, the first priority was understanding the physical evidence. Where were the victims located? How many shots had been fired? From what direction? How close was the shooter? What movements had occurred before and after the attack? Forensic teams documented everything carefully. Photographs captured the condition of the room. Measurements were taken. Evidence markers were placed. Every piece of information was preserved because investigators understood that memory could change, but physical evidence would remain. At the center of the investigation was the weapon. The use of shotguns immediately shaped the way detectives viewed the crime. Shotguns are not subtle weapons. They create destruction that is difficult to ignore. The violence associated with them often suggests strong emotion or a deliberate attempt to cause maximum damage. That raised important questions. Was the killer trying to send a message? Was this an act of revenge? Was the violence personal? Or was it simply the method chosen because it was available? Each possibility led investigators down a different path. The first assumption was that the killer had been an outsider. That assumption was understandable. A family with wealth and social connections could attract enemies. Jose's career gave investigators plenty of potential directions to explore. His professional relationships. His business decisions. His financial dealings. The entertainment industry was filled with competition, and detectives considered whether someone connected to that world had a reason to harm him. But as investigators studied the scene more closely, certain details complicated that theory. There were no obvious signs of a traditional break-in. No clear evidence that someone had forced their way into the house. No immediate indication of robbery. The killer appeared to have entered, carried out the attack, and left without taking the kind of items usually associated with theft. That suggested something important. The person responsible may not have been searching for valuables. They may have been searching for the victims themselves. The difference was significant. A stranger looking for money behaves differently from someone who already knows exactly where the targets will be. And in the Menendez case, the victims' routines were not difficult to learn. Someone close to the family would already know the house. The schedule. The habits. The layout. The moments when the family was most vulnerable. That possibility existed from the beginning. But investigators were cautious. The idea that a son could kill both parents was so disturbing that it required more than suspicion. It required proof. In those early days, Lyle and Eric remained central figures in a strange position. They were both witnesses and beneficiaries. They were grieving sons. They were also the people whose lives would change most dramatically after their parents' deaths. The investigators knew that. They also knew that grief and guilt could look surprisingly similar from the outside. A person experiencing trauma might behave in ways others find unusual. A person hiding responsibility might also behave in unusual ways. The challenge was determining the difference. As detectives continued their work, they began examining the timeline surrounding the murders. The brothers' movements before and after the shooting became increasingly important. Who had been home? Who had left? Who had returned? Who knew where Jose and Kitty would be that night? Every minute mattered. Every gap in the timeline created another question. Meanwhile, the public remained fascinated. The Menendez residence became a symbol of contradiction. A beautiful home. A terrible crime. A wealthy family. A violent ending. Television reports repeatedly showed the same images of the mansion behind police tape. The contrast captured attention. People expected danger to look a certain way. They expected murder to happen in places marked by poverty, desperation, or obvious conflict. Not behind the gates of Beverly Hills. Not in a home associated with success. Not to people who seemed to have everything. That contrast made the case impossible to ignore. The investigation was no longer just about finding a killer. It was about understanding how something like this could happen. How could a family that appeared so successful experience such a devastating collapse? As detectives continued searching for answers, they discovered that the most important evidence would not necessarily come from the crime scene itself. The walls could show what happened. The wounds could show how it happened. But only people could explain why. And the people with the most information were the same people closest to the victims. The sons. The family. The inner circle. The investigation was slowly moving away from the question of whether the crime was committed by a stranger. It was moving toward a much more uncomfortable possibility. That the key to solving the murders had never been outside the house. It had been inside all along. But before suspicion became certainty, investigators still needed something stronger than circumstances. They needed a connection. A motive. A reason. And eventually, they would begin finding those pieces in places that had nothing to do with the crime scene itself. Financial records. Personal relationships. Private conversations. And choices made after the murders that would permanently change how the world viewed Lyle and Eric Menendez.